All right, just in case you need some help filling this in, there's really only a couple of things in here that I'm going to ask you to fill in. So first of all, I want you to be able to identify the length of the period for both sine and cosine, and we identified those as being 2 pi. Next, what is the amplitude? And for for sine and cosine, we said our amplitude was 1. Next up, what is the midline? And for all of our graphs, that actually just ended up being y equals 0. And then finally, for phase shift, we don't really have anything we can put in here for phase shift at this point. What I want to do is fill in the top of this with you really quickly here. So we're looking for some patterns, and on my sine graph above, I'm going to mark again the beginning with the green dot and the end with a red dot. So what I notice is that I start at a midline point. So I start in the middle of my graph. I end also at the midline or in the middle of my graph. Now, when I look at the halfway point, so let's make the halfway point here purple. The halfway point is also on the midline, or in the middle. If you like the word middle better, you can put that. Now I have these quarter points in here. As far as these go, I'm really just asking you to look at between the beginning, the start, and the halfway point, what happens. So up here, I'm at my highest point on my graph. And then finally, I want to mark between the halfway and the ending point. I see I'm at my lowest point on my graph. Okay, I'm going to do that same thing with cosine. So I want to mark the beginning of a cycle with my green dot, and this time I'm starting at my highest point. The end of a cycle also is at the highest point. And guys, this should be true for anything you look at that's cyclical. The beginning and the end must be the same. Now, halfway through one cycle, we're at our lowest point. And then the quarter way point, that's on the midline or the middle of your graph. And then the 3/4 way point is again at the middle or midline of your graph. All right, let's talk about our cosecant and secant graphs. So for these two graphs, we found that the period was 2 pi units long. We found that the amplitude was didn't really exist. We said either none or 1. And you could really put either one here, and I would be okay with that. We then looked at the midline, and we said our midline was just like it was in every other graph, y equals 0. Now, like I said in the previous part, we're not going to talk about phase shift right now. So let's go through and mark the start of the cosecant graph with an asymptote. The end of our cosecant graph will also be an asymptote. And this might be easier to see if you're looking at the Desmos. Halfway through one cycle, we've got another asymptote. And then we've got our quarter way point. And this is at what we'll call the high vertex. Okay, that's the best way we can describe that. And then the 3/4 way point, we're going to be at our low vertex. All right, let's do the same thing for secant. So I always start with what's happening at x equals 0. So when we say start, that's what I'm saying. Start with x equals 0. I've got my high vertex, and then I'm going to end. Hopefully you're figuring this out. I should end the same way. Middle of the graph, halfway through, I'm at my low vertex. And then 1/4 of the way through my cycle, I'm at an asymptote. And then 3/4 of the way through the cycle, I'm at another asymptote. All right, let's go ahead and look at the last two. All right, last but not least, we have our tangent and cotangent graphs. So these were the ones that were a little bit different. The period of the tangent and cotangent graph was just pi. The amplitude, we said there wasn't one for these really at all. And then our midline was the same for all of our graphs. Now, when I go to figure out the starting and ending and all of that, again, I'm going to start with x equals 0. So this time, the start of the period is on the midline. You could also say at the middle of the graph. Now, remember, we end pi units later, and we should end exactly the same way that we started, which was with a point on the midline or in the middle of the graph. Halfway through that function, we're going to be at an asymptote. And then the quarter way point, not really going to worry too much about it, but the quarter way point, we're at y equals 1. And at the 3/4 way point, we're going to be at y equals -1. Okay, and we'll put those on there and we'll talk more about those when we actually get to graphing. So let's look at cotangent. So this one starts with an asymptote, which means that it'll end the same way. All right, so it ends with an asymptote pi units later. Halfway between the beginning and end, we're going to be at a midline point, or in the middle of your graph. You can think of it either way. And then once again, I'll talk about these quarter points later, but our quarter point is at 1, and our 3/4 point is at -1.